Carter's diner was enjoying a sleepy Tuesday afternoon when the grease-stained windows suddenly threatened to shatter from the thunderous vibration of 92 heavy Harley-Davidson engines. The small, checker-floored room filled with suffocating tension as dozens of leather-clad men, each bearing the infamous Hell's Angels patch, crowded inside. Yet, the true heart-stopping moment wasn't caused by their imposing stature or permanent scowls. The silence fell when a 6-year-old girl in a sundress marched straight up to the most dangerous-looking man in the diner, pointed at his bare, scarred forearm, and happily chirped, "My dad has the exact same tattoo." In an instant, 92 hardened bikers froze dead in their tracks. The July heat in Bakersfield, California, was the kind that melted the asphalt and made the air shimmer like a mirage over the highway. Inside Carter's diner, the ancient air conditioning unit rattled and wheezed, fighting a losing battle against the mid-afternoon sun. Sarah Hayes, a 28-year-old single mother, wiped a bead of sweat from her forehead with the back of her wrist. She balanced 3 plates of greasy burgers and fries on her left arm, navigating the narrow aisles between the red vinyl booths with the practiced grace of a woman who had been doing this for far too long. In the corner booth, safely tucked away from the main walkway, sat her 6-year-old daughter, Lily. With her blonde hair tied in messy pigtails and a smear of chocolate milk on her chin, Lily was deeply engrossed in her coloring book, her tiny fingers furiously scrubbing a blue crayon across the page. Since her husband, Arthur, had passed away unexpectedly from aggressive pancreatic cancer just 4 months prior, Sarah couldn't afford childcare. Her boss, Bill Carter, an old Korean War veteran with a soft spot for the young widow, allowed Lily to sit in the corner booth during Sarah's shifts, provided she stayed quiet. It was 2:15 p.m. The lunch rush had died down, leaving only a few truck drivers nursing black coffee and a pair of elderly women splitting a slice of cherry pie. Sarah was just beginning to relax, thinking about the mountain of medical debt waiting for her at home, when she felt it. Before she heard the sound, she felt the vibration in her worn-out sneakers. The floorboards of the diner began to tremble. A low, guttural rumble built in the distance, growing louder and more violent by the second. The coffee in the glass pots on the burner began to ripple. Then came the roar. It sounded like a localized earthquake rolling down Route 99. Sarah looked out the large front window and felt her breath catch in her throat. A massive column of motorcycles, riding 2 abreast in perfect, disciplined formation, was pulling into the diner's expansive dirt parking lot. The chrome of their bikes blinded her in the sun, but it was the uniform that sent a spike of pure, unadulterated panic through her chest. Leather cuts, heavy denim, and on their backs the unmistakable, terrifying winged death head. "Hell's Angels," whispered Bill Carter, emerging from the kitchen with a greasy spatula frozen in his hand. His face, usually ruddy and cheerful, had drained of all color. "Lord have mercy! They're stopping here." Sarah instinctively looked toward the corner booth. Lily was oblivious, holding up a green crayon to inspect the tip. Outside, the engines cut off in a staggered, echoing sequence. The sudden silence that followed now was somehow more intimidating than the roar. The men dismounted. There were nearly 100 of them. They moved with a casual, terrifying confidence, stretching their legs, lighting cigarettes, and adjusting their heavy leather vests. When the front door of the diner opened, the little bell above it gave a pathetic, weak chime that seemed entirely inappropriate for the giants walking through the frame. They flooded in, instantly dwarfing the small establishment. The smell of exhaust, hot engine oil, leather, and stale tobacco overpowered the scent of frying bacon. The few regular customers in the diner immediately abandoned their meals, throwing crumpled dollar bills on the tables and slipping out the back door without making eye contact. Leading the pack was a man who looked like he had been carved out of a granite mountain. He stood at least 6'4", with a thick, graying beard, cold blue eyes, and arms the size of tree trunks, completely covered in ink. On the left breast of his cut, a small patch read President, Oakland Chapter. His name, stitched beneath it, was Dave. Among the brotherhood, he was known as Iron Dave Thompson. Dave approached the counter, his heavy boots thudding against the linoleum. He didn't smile. He looked at Bill, then at Sarah, his gaze lingering on her trembling hands. "We need coffee," Dave said. his voice a deep, gravelly baritone that vibrated in the small room. "And we're gonna need every burger, steak, and egg you got in that kitchen. We're riding through to Arizona. Got cash." He pulled a thick roll of $100 bills from his pocket and dropped it on the Formica counter with a heavy thud. "That cover it?" Bill swallowed hard, nodding vigorously. "Yes, sir. Right away. Sarah, start the coffee pots. Every single one." For the next hour, Carter's diner was a chaotic blur of motion. Sarah moved like a machine on overdrive, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She poured gallons of coffee, carried towering stacks of plates, and dodged the massive frames of the bikers who had commandeered every booth, table, and bar stool in the place. Despite their fearsome reputation, the men were surprisingly orderly. They spoke in low, rumbling voices, occasionally erupting into deep, booming laughter that made Sarah flinch. They didn't harass her, but the sheer, overwhelming presence of 92 heavily armed outlaw bikers was suffocating. Every time she walked past a table, she felt the weight of their history, the violence, the brotherhood, the absolute rejection of society's rules. Through it all, Sarah kept stealing panicked glances at the corner booth. Lily remained quiet, her small world confined to the edges of her coloring book. Sarah prayed silently. "Just stay there, sweetie. Please. Just stay invisible." But as the afternoon wore on, the heat inside the cramped diner became unbearable. The ancient AC finally gave up with a metallic screech, and the temperature began to climb toward 90 degrees indoors. At the center table, Iron Dave Thompson let out an annoyed grunt. He stood up, unbuttoning his heavy leather vest and draping it over the back of his chair. He then unbuttoned the cuffs of his long-sleeved flannel shirt, rolling the sleeves up past his elbows to find some relief from the stifling heat. As he rolled up his right sleeve, he revealed the inside of his thick forearm. There, standing out against a sea of faded skulls and tribal lines, was a very distinct, vibrant tattoo. It was a weeping angel, blindfolded with barbed wire, holding a shattered pocket watch. At the bottom, a banner read a specific date, the 14th of October 2016, and 3 Latin words, "Usque ad finem," until the end. Sarah was at the counter, frantically refilling sugar dispensers, unaware of what was happening. Lily, having finished her masterpiece, a very disproportionate drawing of a purple dog, decided she needed her mother's immediate praise. Slipping out of her booth, the tiny 6-year-old navigated her way through the forest of heavy motorcycle boots and denim-clad legs. She didn't see dangerous outlaws. She just saw grown-ups. As Lily wove past the center table, she stopped dead in her tracks, her big blue eyes locked onto Iron Dave's exposed forearm. She tilted her head, her pigtails swaying, completely transfixed by the weeping angel. Dave, feeling the sudden presence of the child, looked down. His cold blue eyes met Lily's innocent, wide-eyed stare. The biker, sitting next to Dave, a heavily scarred man named Brick Evans, stopped chewing his steak, his hand drifting instinctively toward his belt. Lily didn't flinch. She took a step closer, raised her tiny, crayon-stained finger, and pointed directly at the ink on the club president's arm. Her high-pitched, sweet voice cut through the low rumble of the diner like a knife. "My daddy has that exact same picture on his arm." The reaction was instantaneous, and it was the most terrifying thing Sarah had ever witnessed. It wasn't an explosion of anger or a sudden movement. It was the complete, unnatural absence of sound. 92 men stopped mid-sentence. Forks hovered inches from mouths. Coffee cups were lowered slowly to saucers without a single clink. The heavy, booming laughter died in their throats. Even the jukebox in the corner, playing an old Creedence Clearwater Revival track, suddenly sounded incredibly hollow and isolated in the suffocating silence. Every single pair of eyes in the diner snapped toward the tiny girl standing by the center table. Sarah, hearing her daughter's voice, spun around from the counter. When she saw Lily standing less than 2 feet from the president of the Hells Angels, pointing at his arm, all the blood drained from her face. Her stomach plummeted into her shoes. "Lily!" Sarah gasped, dropping a metal sugar dispenser. It hit the linoleum floor with a sharp, explosive crack that made her jump, but not a single biker flinched. They were entirely focused on the little girl and the man she was addressing. Iron Dave Thompson sat perfectly still. His massive chest stopped rising and falling. He stared at his arm, then slowly, deliberately, turned his gaze back to the 6-year-old girl. His expression was unreadable, a terrifying mask of stone. "What did you say, little bird?" Dave's voice was barely above a whisper, but in the dead-silent diner, it carried to every corner. It wasn't a threat, but it carried a weight so heavy it made the air feel thin. Lily, completely immune to the mortal terror gripping her mother, smiled brightly. "I said, 'My daddy has that picture, on his arm, right there.'" She pointed to her own tiny forearm. "The lady with the wings and the broken clock. He said she was an angel who forgot how to fly." Brick Evans, the massive vice president sitting to Dave's right, slowly lowered his knife. His face, usually twisted into a perpetual scowl, had gone deathly pale beneath his heavy beard. He looked at Dave, his eyes wide with a mixture of disbelief and something else, something that looked dangerously like panic. "Dave," Brick whispered, his voice cracking. "That's a ghostwriter patch. That ain't possible. Only 3 of us got that ink. You, me, and—" Brick couldn't finish the sentence. He swallowed hard, the silence in the room, pressing down on them. Sarah finally broke free from her paralysis. She sprinted across the diner, shoving past a man in a leather vest who simply moved out of her way, like a ghost. She dropped to her knees beside Lily, practically tackling the child and pulling her tightly against her chest. "I am so sorry," Sarah stammered, her voice shaking violently. Tears of pure terror welled up in her eyes. She looked up at Dave, her body shielding her daughter. "I'm so sorry. She's just a kid. She has a wild imagination. She didn't mean any disrespect, sir. Please. We don't want any trouble." Dave didn't look at Sarah. His intense, burning gaze remained locked on Lily, who was now squirming indignantly in her mother's tight grip. "Mom, let go! I just wanted to tell him about Daddy's angel," Lily protested. Dave slowly leaned forward, resting his massive elbows on the table. The wood creaked under his weight. He held up a hand, stopping Sarah's frantic apologies. It was a simple gesture, but it commanded absolute obedience. Sarah clamped her mouth shut, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. "Ma'am," Dave said, his voice surprisingly gentle, though the gravelly undertone remained. "I ain't gonna hurt you. I ain't gonna hurt your little girl." He slowly lowered himself until he was eye level with Lily. He ignored Sarah entirely, speaking directly to the child. "Little bird," Dave said, his eyes scanning Lily's face as if searching for something. "You said your daddy told you the angel forgot how to fly?" Lily nodded eagerly, happy to be listened to. "Uh-huh. He said she broke her clock, so she couldn't tell what time it was to go home to heaven. So she had to stay here." A collective gasp, soft but distinct, rippled through the 92 men in the room. Several bikers in the back booth stood up, craning their necks to look at the little girl. A man with a long gray ponytail near the window took off his sunglasses, wiping a sudden sheen of sweat from his forehead. Dave closed his eyes for a long, agonizing second. When he opened them, the cold, hard steel that had defined his gaze was gone, replaced by a storm of violent, conflicting emotions. "That story," Dave whispered, his voice trembling slightly. "I haven't heard that story in 10 years. He looked at Sarah, really looking at her for the first time. He noted the dark circles under her eyes, the exhaustion in her posture, the cheap, faded fabric of her waitress uniform. "Ma'am," Dave said, his voice tightening. "What is your husband's name?" Sarah swallowed, her throat dry as sandpaper. She didn't understand what was happening, but the sheer intensity of the room told her that lying was the worst possible thing she could do. His name was Arthur," Sarah stammered, her voice breaking on his name. "Arthur Hayes." The name dropped into the diner like a bomb. If the room was silent before, it was a total vacuum now. Brick Evans fell back into his chair, his heavy frame hitting the vinyl backrest with a dull thud. He buried his face in his massive hands, dragging them down his scarred cheeks. "Holy Mother of God!" Brick breathed into his palms. "Artie. It's Artie's kid." A low murmur broke out among the older members of the club. Hard men, men with rap sheets as long as their arms, men who had seen the worst of humanity, were suddenly looking at each other with wide, shocked eyes. Some removed their bandanas. Others stared at the floor, shaking their heads in disbelief. Dave Thompson, the president of the Oakland Hells Angels, the man feared by cartels and law enforcement alike, sat back in his chair. He looked at the little girl with the blonde pigtails, and a single, treacherous tear escaped the corner of his eye, tracking down his weathered cheek and losing itself in his thick beard. Arthur Hayes, Dave repeated, the name tasting like ashes and old regrets. He looked at Sarah, his eyes pleading for a truth he dreaded. Where is he? Where is Arthur? Sarah held Lily closer, her confusion rapidly overriding her fear. These men, these outlaws who rode with death on their backs, were reacting to her husband's name as if it were holy scripture. I don't understand, Sarah whispered, looking from Dave to the emotional men surrounding them. How do you know Arthur? He was an accountant. He worked for a logistics firm in Fresno. He didn't ride motorcycles. A harsh, bitter laugh erupted from Brick. He dragged his hands away from his face, looking at Sarah with a mixture of pity and sorrow. An accountant? Brick scoffed, shaking his head. Artie, you crazy son of a bitch. An accountant. Dave raised his hand again, and Brick instantly went silent. Ma'am, Dave said, his voice thick with emotion. He leaned forward, gesturing to the tattoo on his forearm. The weeping angel, the broken watch, the barbed wire. This ink here. It ain't something you just buy at a parlor. It's what we call a Ghost Rider mark. Only 3 men in the history of this club ever earned it. He pointed to himself, then to Brick. Me, Brick, and a young prospect we had 10 years ago. A kid who rode like a demon and fought like a cornered lion. A kid named Arthur Hayes. Sarah's mind spun. Arthur? A Hell's Angel? It was impossible. Her Arthur was a quiet man. He wore cardigans. He loved gardening. He spent his weekends building intricate dollhouses for Lily. He was gentle, soft-spoken, and hated confrontation. You're mistaken, Sarah said firmly, finding a sudden burst of courage in defending her husband's memory. Arthur was never in a gang. He never even had a speeding ticket. We've been together for 8 years. 8 years, Dave calculated quietly. That lines up. 10 years ago, on October 14th, the date on this tattoo, our chapter got ambushed by a rival syndicate down in Long Beach. It was a bad setup. We were pinned down in an old warehouse. They had automatic weapons. We were bleeding out. Dave paused, the memories clearly violently playing out behind his eyes. He swallowed hard. I took 2 rounds in the chest, Dave continued, his voice dropping to a somber rasp. I was dying on that concrete floor. Brick here had his leg nearly blown off. We were done. The club was going to die in that warehouse. But Arthur wasn't a full-patch member yet. He was just a prospect, supposed to be watching the bikes outside. The entire diner was hanging on Dave's every word. The older bikers, who had been there, stared at the floor, lost in the trauma of that night. The younger ones, who only knew the legend, leaned in, staring at Sarah and the little girl. Arthur didn't run, Dave said, his voice cracking. He took a shotgun, kicked the back door off its hinges, and walked straight into hell. He drew their fire. He took 3 bullets meant for us, but he kept moving. He dragged me out of the kill zone. He dragged Brick out. He held them off until the sirens came. Dave reached out with a trembling, calloused hand, gently pointing to Lily. He told me that story about the angel with the broken clock while we were in the back of a stolen van, bleeding. He said if he didn't make it, that angel was going to be him stuck here, watching over his brothers. Sarah's breath hitched. She felt dizzy. The story was impossible, yet it explained so much. It explained the massive, jagged scars on Arthur's back that he claimed came from a childhood car accident. It explained his absolute refusal to ever take off his shirt at the beach. It explained his quiet intensity, his hypervigilance in crowded spaces. When the feds came down on us after the shootout, Dave continued, Arthur was looking at 20 years for unregistered weapons and assault. But he cut a deal. He didn't rat us out. He took the sole blame for the weapons, but the feds, they didn't put him in prison. They offered him a way out, witness protection, or something like it. They wiped his record, relocated him, and told him if he ever contacted us again, the deal was off, and we'd all go to federal lockup. Dave looked at Sarah, his cold eyes shimmering. He gave up the only family he knew, his brotherhood, to keep us out of cages. He took the ghost path. We thought he was dead for years, until we found out about the federal deal through a lawyer. We've been looking for him for a decade, ma'am. Not to hurt him, to thank him, to give him his cut of what we built. Dave stood up slowly, his massive frame towering over Sarah. He took off his leather cut, the one bearing the president's patch, and held it in his hands. Sarah, Dave said, using her name for the first time. Where is my brother? Where is Arthur? Please, let me see him. Sarah felt a sob rip through her chest. The dam broke. All the exhaustion, the grief of the last 4 months, and the shock of this revelation crashed down on her at once. She pulled Lily tight against her, the little girl now looking up at her mother with worried eyes. Sarah looked up at the towering, terrifying president of the Hells Angels, her vision blurred with hot tears. You're too late, Sarah whispered, her voice breaking. Arthur passed away 4 months ago. Pancreatic cancer. The words hung in the stifling air of the diner like a death sentence. For a second, nobody moved. Then, the reaction rippled through the room. Brick Evans, the giant, scarred vice president, let out a sound that was half sob, half roar, slamming his fist down on the table so hard the heavy ceramic coffee mug shattered. Several men turned away, burying their faces in their hands. A terrifyingly large biker near the door dropped to his knees, his hands gripping his hair. Dave Thompson stumbled backward, as if he had been physically struck in the chest. He bumped into the table behind him, his massive hands gripping the edge for support. His face, hardened by decades of violence and outlaw life, completely crumbled. The president of the Hells Angels bowed his head, and in front of his entire chapter, he wept. Sarah sat on the floor, holding the daughter of a secret legend, surrounded by 92 outlaws who were mourning the husband she never truly knew. The silence in Carter's diner was no longer born of fear, but of a profound, collective mourning. Outside, the brutal July sun continued to beat down on the dusty asphalt of Route 99, but inside, the atmosphere was thick, with the chilling weight of a 10-year-old debt that could never be fully repaid. Bill Carter, the old Korean War veteran who owned the diner, stood motionless behind the counter. In his 74 years, he had seen men break in combat, but watching 92 hardened outlaws, men who wore their defiance of the law, like armor crumble into raw, unfiltered grief, was something that defied belief. Dave Thompson slowly rose to his full height. He wiped his face with the back of his massive, tattooed hand, his chest heaving as he fought to lock his emotions back inside the vault. He looked down at Sarah, who was still sitting on the floor, clutching Lily. The little girl, sensing the deep sorrow in the room, had stopped squirming and was gently patting her mother's arm. Dave extended a hand the size of a dinner plate down to Sarah. "Get up, Sarah," Dave said, his voice raspy, stripped of its earlier intimidating boom. "Please, you shouldn't be on the floor." Sarah hesitated for a fraction of a second before reaching out. Dave's grip was surprisingly gentle as he pulled her to her feet with effortless strength. He then crouched down again, looking at Lily with a soft, reverent expression. "Your daddy," Dave said to the 6-year-old, "was the bravest man I ever met. You understand that, little bird? He was a hero." Lily nodded solemnly. "I know. He fought the dragons so the angels could rest." Brick Evans, wiping his eyes with a greasy bandana, let out a wet chuckle. "Yeah, kid, he sure did." Dave turned his attention back to Sarah. His sharp blue eyes scanned her faded uniform, the cheap scuff marks on her orthopedic work shoes, and the deep lines of exhaustion etched around her eyes. The grief in his expression was rapidly being replaced by a fierce, calculating intensity. "Sarah," Dave started, his tone shifting from mourning to business. "Arthur was a smart man, an accountant, you said. If he was running numbers, he should have been making good money. Why are you working a double shift in a roadside diner while your little girl sits in a vinyl booth?" Sarah looked away, ashamed. "Arthur did make good money," she whispered, twisting the fabric of her apron. We had a beautiful home in the suburbs. We had savings. But the cancer. It was stage 4 pancreatic. By the time they found it, it was everywhere. She took a shaky breath, the terrifying reality of her life creeping back in. The experimental treatments weren't covered by our insurance. Arthur wanted to fight. He wanted to stay for Lily. So, we drained the savings. Then we took out second mortgages. Then the credit cards. When he passed, he left a mountain of medical debt. The bank is foreclosing on our house next week. I took this job because Bill lets me keep Lily here. But it's not enough. We're going to lose everything. A dark, dangerous shadow passed over Dave's face. He looked at Brick, and a silent, terrifying communication passed between the two men. The sorrow in the room instantly vanished, replaced by an electric, volatile anger. But it wasn't directed at Sarah. A man saves the lives of an entire chapter, Brick growled, his hands balling into fists, gives up his whole identity to keep us free, and his widow is about to be thrown out on the street over hospital bills. Not on my watch, Dave said. His voice was cold steel again. Not while I have breath in my lungs. Dave took a step closer to Sarah. When Arthur made that deal with the feds 10 years ago, he didn't just save me and Brick from a bullet. He saved our entire infrastructure. The club owns legitimate businesses, Sarah. Real estate, custom auto shops, logistics companies. We built an empire, and Arthur is the reason we weren't locked in federal prison while the state seized it all. Dave reached into his heavy denim jacket. Arthur has a cut of everything we've built over the last 10 years. We've been holding it in an escrow account through a shell corporation, waiting for the day he might reach out. It's sitting there, collecting interest. Sarah shook her head, overwhelmed. I can't take your money. Arthur left that life behind. He wouldn't want me involved in whatever it is you do. It's not club money, Dave insisted, his eyes locking onto hers with unwavering sincerity. It's clean, it's legal, and it's his. But more than that, did Arthur leave anything for you? Anything you didn't understand? A message? A letter? Sarah froze. Her mind raced back to Arthur's final days in the hospice wing. He had been heavily medicated, drifting in and out of consciousness. But on his last clear night, he had gripped her hand with surprising strength and pointed to the small, fireproof lockbox he kept in the back of his closet. If the thunder ever rolls in, Sarah, Arthur had gasped, his breathing labored. If the thunder rolls in and you have nowhere left to run, open the black box. Give them the watch. She had assumed it was the morphine talking. She had opened the box after his funeral, finding nothing but an old, shattered pocket watch, a folded piece of heavy parchment, and a strange, embroidered piece of fabric that looked like a crescent moon. It made no sense to her, so she had locked it away and forgotten about it in her frantic scramble to pay the bills. The thunder, Sarah gasped, her hands flying to her mouth. She looked at the 92 bikers, realizing the deafening roar of their engines pulling into the lot. The thunder. He left a box. He told me to give you the watch. Dave's breath hitched. Where is it? It's at my house. About 10 minutes from here. Dave turned to the room. Mount up! He roared. The diner exploded into motion. 92 men moved with military precision, leaving stacks of $100 bills on the tables, far more than enough to cover the food they hadn't even eaten. Bill Carter watched them go, leaning over the counter. Sarah, Bill said softly as she prepared to follow them. You go. Your shift is covered. Forever, if you need it to be. The procession down the quiet, sun-baked suburban streets of Bakersfield was a sight that would be talked about for decades. Sarah drove her battered Honda Civic at exactly 30 miles per hour. Flanking her on all sides, completely blocking the two-lane road, was a heavily armed escort of Hell's Angels. The roar of the engines brought neighbors out of their houses, standing on their manicured lawns in shock and terror as the leather-clad army rolled through their quiet neighborhood. Sarah pulled into the driveway of her small, single-story ranch home. The lawn was overgrown, a glaring symbol of the yard work Arthur could no longer do. The bikers parked along the street, killing their engines. The sudden silence was deafening. Dave and Brick escorted Sarah and Lily to the front door, standing guard on the porch while Sarah went inside. The rest of the club formed a perimeter around the property, their arms crossed, their expressions daring anyone to approach. Minutes later, Sarah emerged. Her hands were shaking violently as she held out a small, heavy black lockbox. She handed it to Dave. With thick, trembling fingers, the giant man popped the latch. He opened the lid, and the color drained from his face. Inside sat a heavy, silver pocket watch, its glass face shattered, the hands permanently frozen at 10:14. Beneath it lay a crescent-shaped piece of black fabric, with white stitching, the bottom rocker patch of a Hells Angels prospect, bearing the word Oakland. And finally, a sealed envelope. On the front, written in Arthur's neat, precise accountant's handwriting, were 2 words. For Dave. Dave handed the box to Brick and carefully opened the envelope. He pulled out a single sheet of paper. The entire front yard was dead silent. The only sound was the rustling of the leaves in the July breeze. Dave began to read aloud, his gravelly voice echoing off the vinyl siding of the houses. Dave, if you are reading this, it means my time ran out, and my girls needed help. I never regretted the choice I made in that warehouse. I gave up my brothers, but the universe gave me Sarah and Lily in return. I got to know peace. I got to be a father. But I always knew the cancer would come for the Bidson High. I'm leaving them with nothing but debts, and it breaks my heart. I kept my vow of silence to the feds, and I kept you safe. Now, I am cashing in my marker. Look after my girls, brother. The angel's clock is broken, but she still needs her wings. Usque ad finem, Arthur. When Dave finished, he slowly folded the letter. He looked at the shattered pocket watch in the box, the exact watch depicted in the tattoo on his arm. The watch Arthur had kept on him during the shootout, shattered by a bullet that would have pierced his heart. Dave looked at Sarah, who was openly crying, the reality of her husband's secret life fully settling in. He looked at little Lily, who was staring up at the giant bikers with nothing but absolute trust. Brick, Dave barked, his voice thick but authoritative. Brick stepped forward, pulling a thick leather-bound ledger and a satellite phone from his saddlebag. Call the lawyers in San Francisco, Dave commanded. I want the escrow account unlocked immediately. I want the mortgage on this house paid in full by 5 p.m. today. I want every single hospital, clinic, and credit card company called and paid off. And set up a trust for Lily. $5 million to start. Do it now. Sarah gasped, stumbling backward. $5 million? Dave, no, I can't. It's done, Sarah, Dave interrupted gently. It was Arthur's money. He earned it with his blood. You will never have to worry about a bill, a mortgage, or a college tuition ever again. Dave then knelt down on the dusty concrete of the driveway, bringing himself eye level with Lily. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, heavy silver pin, the winged death head. He gently pinned it to the strap of Lily's sundress. Little bird, Dave said, a fierce, protective light burning in his eyes. Your daddy was our brother. That makes you our blood. If you ever need anything, if you ever get scared, if anyone ever tries to hurt you, or if you just want to hear stories about how brave your dad was, you call us. The thunder will always roll in for you. Lily smiled, reaching out and wrapping her tiny arms around Dave's massive, leather-clad neck. The fearsome president of the Oakland Hells Angels closed his eyes and hugged the little girl back, a single tear dropping onto her blonde hair. As the sun began to set over Bakersfield, painting the sky in violent shades of orange and purple, the 92 engines roared back to life. But they didn't all leave. As Dave led the main column out of the neighborhood, heading toward the highway, 4 bikers remained behind. They parked their heavy Harleys at the 4 corners of Sarah's property. They sat on their bikes, arms crossed, watching the street. Sarah stood on the porch, holding Lily's hand, no longer feeling the crushing weight of the world on her shoulders. She looked at the men guarding her home, knowing that Arthur's ghost was standing right beside them. The angel had finally found her wings. What an incredible, heart-stopping testament to the power of loyalty, sacrifice, and unexpected brotherhood. Arthur's secret life, and the ultimate redemption of his family, proves that true heroes come in many forms, and sometimes the fiercest protectors are the ones society fears the most. The bond of the Ghost Rider didn't just save those men in a warehouse. It secured a future for a little girl and a grieving widow when all hope was lost. If this incredible real-life story of the Hells Angels, Arthur's sacrifice, and little Lily's bravery touched your heart, please hit that like button to honor his memory. Don't forget to share this video with your friends and family to spread this amazing tale of brotherhood, and make sure you subscribe to our channel for more unbelievable, dramatic true stories that will leave you absolutely speechless. See you in the next one.
Hi, my name is Dominant Flame Escrow, the owner and manager of Dominant Flame Escrow. After watching the video, my dad has the same tattoo. Little girl said, 92 bikers freeze when they realize the truth. I'd really like to know what you think. How did this story make you feel? What stood out to me most was the feeling of surprise mixed with reflection. Sometimes a few simple words can uncover connections that nobody expected and change the way people see a situation. Stories like this remind us that every person has a history, and sometimes the smallest details can carry a much deeper meaning. What was the moment that caught your attention the most? Did the little girl's comment change the way you viewed the story as it unfolded? I'd love to hear how you interpreted the events and what message you took from them. One thing I took away from this story is the value of paying attention and keeping an open mind. We don't always know the full story behind the people we meet, and a little curiosity and understanding can go a long way. Thanks for watching and spending part of your day with us. If this story gave you something to think about, feel free to share your thoughts in the comments. And if you enjoy stories like these, a like or subscription is always appreciated if you feel the channel is worth following.